Hello, everyone. My name is Hayden. I'm a senior policy analyst at the BC Ministry of Energy, Mines, and Low Carbon Innovation in the Energy and Industry Decarbonization branch, or the branch responsible for the BC Hydrogen strategy that was released in July and that we are now turning towards implementing. And I will get my slides up here. One sec. Here we go. All right, can you see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Great, okay. So yeah, like I said, our group is responsible for the BC Hydrogen strategy. The presentation I'm going to give today may be a little introductory for some folks on the call, but it's probably good to just get us all up to speed, be on the same level for the conversation that might follow and the presentations that may follow mine. So I'm looking forward to it. I also want to note that I'm calling in today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples in Victoria. Oh, sorry, some technical difficulties here. One sec. Can you guys see that full screen again?
Yes.
There we go. Sorry, I wasn't able to change slides before. So what I'm looking to talk to you guys about, just a quick overview of what is hydrogen and why is it important now, especially to the province of British Columbia, looking into the BC Hydrogen strategy, and then wrapping up with letting everyone know what our priorities are for strategy implementation as we move into the fall. So what is hydrogen? How is it used? It's the most abundant element in the universe, with about 75% of it being hydrogen atoms or H atoms. The exciting thing is you put two of those together and you'll get hydrogen gas, which is very energy rich. When it's combusted, you get heat, and when combined with oxygen in a fuel cell, you'll get electricity. And the great thing about that is basically producing no carbon emissions at the point of use when using hydrogen. And that means that hydrogen can be used to decarbonize a wide variety of applications, especially those that aren't practical to electrify. That's important to note from the province's perspective, given we are prioritizing our clean electricity. But hydrogen can be used in a wide range of sectors. As you can see there, heavy duty transport, heating, and industry processes are just a couple of examples. We often get asked, why hydrogen now? And you'll see here in the 80s and 90s, it was really an adjunct to fuel cell development and commercialization strategies. Again, in the early 2000s, it was seen as a pathway to overcome the limitations of EVs, essentially. And in both of those hype cycles, it was really seen as a means to an end. Obviously, you need the fuel for your technology to run on. The exciting thing now is that hydrogen provides a flexible tool to reduce emissions in not just transportation, but in a wide range of areas, as well as just providing a wide range of economic opportunities where emission reductions may be happening elsewhere other than BC. So hydrogen is important today because it's recognized as a key pathway for reducing emissions in those hard to decarbonize sectors. If you look on the right side of the screen, you'll see the energy demand in BC, and that 66% of BC's energy use comes in the form of fossil fuels. Where hydrogen can come and play into this is, well, in one form, electrification by other means, and that's leveraging BC's clean electricity to produce hydrogen, which can then be used in areas that aren't practical to electrify. Of course, there's other pathways of hydrogen production, which I'll get into in a second. Hydrogen also complements BC's energy sector and really importantly uses existing workers' skills the province's infrastructure and regulations, and how that will all play into building out our hydrogen economy. BC's policy landscape is also in a really good place for incentivizing hydrogen uses, and that's all with existing policies in place as part of Clean BC, and we have quite a few actions within the BC hydrogen strategy to bolster that even more. BC hydrogen strategy, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, was released just back in July, which was a great moment for us. It was a Clean BC commitment, so it's great to act on that and make sure that we were able to achieve the commitment that was in Clean BC from 2018. The strategy clarifies how the province will promote, incentivize, and support the development of hydrogen production, use, and export over the next 10 years and beyond. And you can kind of see in the last bullet there how it's laid out across the 63 policy actions in the short, medium, and long term. I also want to point out something that's important, that many of those 63 policy actions we've identified will trigger the duty to consult with Indigenous peoples. And it's something that we fully intend to do early and often as we start the development of things, say like legislative changes as we get into the fall here. We're in a pretty good place when we talk about developing BC's hydrogen economy. We're already recognized as a world leader in fuel cell and hydrogen technologies with over 70 hydrogen companies in BC, and that makes up 51% approximately of Canada's total. You'll see if you read any of the federal government's hydrogen strategy that BC is just mentioned again and again for good reason, as you can see here for what we make up Canada's total. Exports of BC hydrogen technology have been really important in enabling industry growth, both in BC and in deployment in other jurisdictions. However, what we're really looking to do, and a big part of the hydrogen strategy, is get the local deployment of local hydrogen technologies to grow our hydrogen economy. So going back to the policy landscape that we have, and really thanks to Clean BC, that we're in a good place to support the initial production and use of low carbon hydrogen. We have the BC carbon tax, which is currently at $40 per ton. It will be moving up to $50. There's the BC zero emission vehicle mandate for light duty vehicles. That also includes hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. There's the greenhouse gas reduction regulation, which allows utilities to reduce emissions through prescribed undertakings and was recently amended to include certain pathways of hydrogen production. There's also the Clean BC 15% renewable natural gas target, which includes hydrogen. There's the low carbon fuel standard, and really interesting one that we're starting to see movement on in the hydrogen space is the Clean BC target for 80% reduction of diesel consumption in remote communities by 2030. So as I said, this may be a little bit of an introductory presentation for some of you, but we can just quickly go over kind of the main hydrogen production pathways. There's obviously some that are high carbon and others that are widely considered low carbon. The high carbon being steam, methane reformation, natural gas without any sort of carbon capture or utilization. You add adequate and permanent carbon capture, storage, or utilization, and that can be moved into the low carbon area. There's also methane pyrolysis of natural gas, electrolysis, which is essentially sending current through water to break up the hydrogen and oxygen atoms, and byproduct hydrogen, where we're starting to see some movement on in the province too. Regardless of pathway, something that's really critical is another action that we've committed to within the strategy is to establish carbon intensity thresholds. And essentially what this will do is ensure that the production of hydrogen in BC does not increase the province's emission inventory. That's important, obviously, for a wide variety of reasons. Using hydrogen in BC, we've identified in the strategy 6 main uses. There's, of course, more. I'm hoping that Tyler, in your presentation, you may touch a little bit more on the first one. which is lowering the carbon intensity of natural gas or lowering the emissions from it by blending low carbon hydrogen into the natural gas grid. We also have hydrogen fuel cell vehicles that can be used for zero emission transportation. You can use low carbon hydrogen to reduce the emissions of basically the fuels that we're used to today with gasoline, diesel, because hydrogen is used to refine those fuels, but it's currently high carbon hydrogen. So if you replace that, the low carbon source of hydrogen, you're going to reduce emissions of the final product. It's of course an option for power generation and storage when we're talking about firming intermittent renewable energy sources. It can be used in industrial processes when you're trying to achieve process heats that are basically too high to be achieved through electrification, and you need to combust a fuel. And then also a big economic opportunity for BC is via export. As you can see with this graphic of a map down below, BC is in a really good geographical position when we're talking about being nearby or at least having good access to emerging markets, where you have Japan, South Korea, California, and China. Those 4 markets alone are estimated to be half of the global market for hydrogen by 2050 and equal approximately $305 billion. So if you can imagine if BC and its residents can capture even a small amount of that, there'll be significant revenue for the province as a result. Getting a little bit more into fueling clean economic development for British Columbians. As part of releasing this strategy, we really think that hydrogen will benefit British Columbians, basically with clean economic opportunities across the hydrogen value chain. And that includes opportunities for Indigenous communities and businesses. We're already starting to work with an Indigenous community to see how hydrogen can displace diesel. They are diesel dependent communities, so how hydrogen can displace diesel there, and as well how perhaps their surplus can result in revenue for them. It also provides opportunity for new skilled trades and professional clean energy jobs, and importantly, and related to the transition of the natural gas sector. BC has a very strong natural gas sector with many individuals and communities relying on it. And if hydrogen can be a part of decarbonizing that area, then that's something that we would like to support and see. So implementing the strategy is a bit of a daunting process. We have 63 policy actions, as I mentioned. We've kind of broken those down into 6 or 7 priority objectives, you could call them. And that starts with incentivizing production of renewable and low carbon hydrogen in the province. We currently don't have any sizable production that we can speak of, although there are projects on the way. Developing hydrogen hubs where hydrogen production use are co-located is also going to be very important. That's because it gets us by the chicken and egg issue, where instead of having producers looking for the demand certainty and off-takers looking for supply certainty, you get those projects growing in unison, and therefore you get around that issue, or at least reduce it significantly. The province is also going to be deploying fuel cell electric vehicles and infrastructure, mainly through our Go Electric programs, especially as they start to expand into the heavy duty space. We're expanding the use of hydrogen across industrial sectors and applications. That's important going back to the beginning of this presentation, where hydrogen back to the 80s and 90s really was focused on the transportation area. We want to be able to use hydrogen in several areas, hard to decarbonize sectors. The province wants to promote cost-effective adoption of hydrogen for decarbonization. So again, transportation, of course, one of those, but there's several areas where that occurs. The BC Centre for Innovation in Clean Energy was announced as part of Stronger BC, which I believe came out last year, and then had budget allocated to it in the last provincial budget. And that's for more than just hydrogen, but we'll do a lot to help commercialize new hydrogen technology and using that local technology here in BC. And as a wrap for all of this, it's really important to know that we are establishing those ambitious carbon intensity thresholds for whatever hydrogen is produced in BC to ensure we can stick to those claims that it's renewable and low carbon hydrogen. So that's that for now. I'm happy to answer any questions, whether it's in this presentation or after the fact. See my emails here. I'm looking forward to the other presentations and questions that may come after. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hayden. That was great. Good intro. Anybody have any questions?
It's Rob here. I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Just on the last slide with the bullets. So I think you referred to chicken and egg. So reducing the cost of hydrogen, producing hydrogen is important. So incentivizing production of renewable or low carbon hydrogen and helping to reduce the costs of that is an important starting point on the, shall we say, on the one side of the balance sheet. So have you got any policies in place to do that or funding? I would note that there's, for example, on the federal side, there are two funding initiatives out right now. One is the carbon capture and storage one, which through NRCan, which is important because that is the fundamental piece for establishing hydrogen hubs. If you're going to do a hydrogen hub, you're going to need probably CCS to get cost-effective hydrogen. Steam methane reforming is the answer, and you need CCS to go with it. So the question is, do you have any funding to go with CCS? Because that's an important part of a hydrogen hub. And then the second one would be, NRCan also has funding out for the low carbon fuels. And so does BC have anything equivalent in that bucket as well?
Yeah, good question. I think it's fair to say for now, having just released our strategy, we're really looking to see what plays out with those two federal pots of funding. We are in the stage right now and we're looking towards budget 22 for the province of BC, where we can add to that. It's an especially dynamic process when you look at the federal election that's occurring, but we do know that there's a gap and that for hydrogen, whether in hubs or otherwise, to occur and to scale, that it's going to require funding. So I can't say that we have anything like that right now, but it's very much on our radar. And if hydrogen was the only priority of the province, you'd probably see that happen a lot quicker. But yeah, it's on our radar, and hopefully we can see something soon in that area.
Yeah, well, for sure, you're going to need funding for 2022 budget because, well, you've got a pretty deep commitment for 2030, right?
Of course.
40%. So I guess in my estimation, you need to have money in your budget for next year on this item.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob and Hayden. Others with questions or comments? Good for now.
Yeah, I'm also, when this email or the presentation shared around, more than happy to answer impromptu email questions as well.
Yeah, that's great, Hayden. Appreciate that. Okay, over to you, Tyler.
Sure. So I was actually planning, Alex, for this to be pretty brief, just for the people on the calls to know that Fortis is kind of embarking on a pretty ambitious work plan on hydrogen development and deployment here in the province. So we have 7 different projects identified, working with different types of project partners, working on our own, working on all different types of hydrogen projects. So some located in the lower mainland, with hydrogen with electrolysis technology, others looking at different solutions that would potentially use natural gas as a feedstock and using a low carbon conversion technology to convert that natural gas to hydrogen. As Hayden mentioned, the provincial government recently amended the greenhouse gas reduction regulations. So this means now, this is actually pretty big, at least in the world of regulated utilities, is that we can now produce and acquire hydrogen so long as it is under $30 per gigajoule, and insofar as it doesn't exceed 15% of our load. And so that means that Fortis can own all the hydrogen infrastructure that's required, and it can also partner with different project teams as an off-taker for hydrogen. And so over the short term, we'll be announcing some projects in the next 2 years here. And coinciding with this, we are about to conduct a very detailed hydrogen feasibility study on all gas infrastructure assets in the province. So this will be in coordination with Enbridge, FortisBC, Pacific Northern Gas, to basically do what we call as an inch-by-inch evaluation of the gas system in order for its ability to handle hydrogen at different blends. And so a lot of work is happening. We see a lot of opportunity with First Nations, Indigenous communities to partner in potential hydrogen projects. We see the gas system moving to a more distributed type of supply system where there's different gas supply options located all over the province. So we see lots of opportunities for Indigenous communities all over the province. So outside, so right now the gas supply system is more or less kind of a single kind of straw from the Montney area to the lower mainland, to be overly simplistic about it, but it's kind of a hub and spoke model in a way. And with the renewable gas type of push, we'll see different supply projects happen all over BC. And as long as it's kind of tied into gas infrastructure, it can happen in the Okanagan region. It can happen, obviously in the region around the Montney, the Denizah region, and what have you. But also here closer in the Metro Vancouver, Lower Mainland, and South Coast regions as well. So we're kind of in very kind of furious table setting mode for this all to happen, and a lot of kind of just boring business case and technical stuff needs to be or is being addressed right now. But in the next 2 to 3 years is when we'll see some important announcements and important progress on actual hydrogen projects taking off in this province. And so we see this as an area of significant growth and significant potential for partnerships and for reconciliation with First Nations groups, Indigenous communities. And that's the end of my remarks, Alex or Shanda.
Great. Well, thanks, Tyler. I have a question. I think at this point, the FNCI nations are thinking about hydrogen as a way to sort of repurpose gas infrastructure, and then the blending thing is an aspect of that, which is already kind of inherent in the current infrastructure, and the new infrastructure, if it's built, could be built with that in mind. If the question is this, if some of the nations involved in FNCI or affiliated with FNCI want to jump right to hydrogen, what would we need to do in this project? And what we're doing here is kicking off a discussion that's not going to end today, but end 6 months from now. What would we need to do in this project in order for nations to seriously consider an opportunity to get involved in the emerging industry that you're talking about?
That's an excellent question, Alex. And for the nations and bands that are part of FNCI, I would have to spend some more time kind of brainstorming what that really looks like. Because it's not necessarily needing to tie into gas infrastructure. So one of the interesting concepts that we're trying to advance at the provincial government is this concept of displacement. So using hydrogen primarily in industrial locations to displace whatever other fuels that they're using for their processes. And so we like that idea because, you know, for the first thing, we think those will be the first projects that really get off the ground here in BC, because there is likely the best business case for that, and there's probably the least amount of technical challenges of, say, finding a pulp mill or a cement plant or LNG plant, what have you, to displace another type of energy that they're using with hydrogen. And that would lead to greenhouse gas emission reductions. And that doesn't necessarily need to be located on Fortis BC's gas infrastructure, so long as we're achieving greenhouse gas emission reductions. And so I just bring that up because that may be of interest. That, you know, one of the limitations maybe, does this hook into Fortis BC's infrastructure? And it doesn't, well, this is all kind of an open canvas right now. So we're being as creative as possible in what end uses, what type of commercial agreements we can come to on this. That would be one area. The other area, of course, is in power production. So renewable power production to support an electrolyzer. A lot of policy details need to be worked out here as well. Most notably, kind of moving power through BC Hydro system, that type of thing. We want to kind of have discussions about what an updated system like that could look like that would support, say, First Nations utilities and other type of projects that may end up providing feedstock electricity for hydrogen. So that's another area of interest.
I think if it's okay if I add a little bit to what you mentioned, Tyler. It's also, I think, a unique opportunity, and starting to see this with at least one BC First Nation, is getting around the chicken and egg issue basically yourself. When you look at the nations within FNCI, we talk about hydrogen hubs having multiple parties being involved and needing to have at least a producer and an off-taker to move forward together. However, if there is an opportunity to pair the two sides of the coin when you talk about production or supply and demand, if there's a way to get around the issue with whether it's FNCI or one couple of the nations within it, then that's also a unique opportunity. And again, further to what Tyler said, the applications for hydrogen are wide-reaching, but you also have to make sure that you're careful where hydrogen fits in as far as the best use for renewable energy and where the cost-effective emission reductions are occurring. Because if you can direct electrify, that's going to be your best bet to do first. But hydrogen is a very important tool in the toolkit.
Thanks for that. And so let's just leave it as an open question and an interesting one for now. But suffice to say that many of the nations that are involved in what we're doing would jump at the opportunity if they could see it as an opportunity. And so part of what our challenge is communication. And one of the things that we're thinking about communicating now is how gas relates to hydrogen production and communicating that. And I mean, the education process that's occurring right now with respect to complicated things like, thermoplasma pyrolysis in First Nations communities is quite remarkable. But it's not, that's just the beginning, not the end. And so as we move forward, I think it would be great if we thought about ways in which those of you that are kind of involved in hydrogen policy or development of hydrogen as a resource, we can enable nations to learn about the opportunities through this process, whether they relate to gas or not. I don't know, Candace, Amanda, Shanda, do you think that's a reasonable thing to lay down?
Yes, I do, Alex.
Yeah, I know. Go ahead.
Fit with that, I was going to say there is an action within the BC hydrogen strategy specifically related to education. So there's definitely alignment from the province's side for what you're looking for, Alex, or at least suggesting.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's move on. Unless there's other questions, let's move on to Rob.
Sure thing. Maybe Shanda, could you? Oh, there we go. I think some of you have seen this before. I know Hayden, you have, right? Yeah. And
yes.
Tyler, have you seen this thing before?
I'm not sure that I have, Rob.
Oh, okay. All right. Fair enough. Well, I just build on some of the things that both presentations have been talking about. And so I'll let Shanda maybe page through. There is an intro piece here, which I think Hayden has covered fairly well. What is hydrogen? So I don't need to redo that, but there I show a hydrogen molecule on the left. And of course, a water molecule, and the hydrogens are the blue on that middle molecule, and the gray, of course, is an oxygen. And then the one on the right is methane, and that one, the four yellows are actually the hydrogen, and the middle molecule would be a carbon atom. So there we are. There's sort of the three building blocks that we're talking about quite often, although we're getting into other things called methanol, ammonia. We'll talk a little bit more about those things because they are also great hydrogen carriers and fairly simple molecular structures. But hydrogen on its own is the one on the left, the simplest, and burns without emissions. We talked about that. Relatively high energy content by mass. The third point is important. Very little hydrogen naturally occurring in the environment. We have to manufacture it. And of course, that's either using water, methane, or other hydrocarbons or other approaches. So we'll talk about that. Next slide, please. And then we've also talked about its diverse use of potential diverse set of uses. So I don't think I need to talk about that anymore, other than the fuel bucket, the heat, and the petrochemicals. The next one is from McKinsey's report of July this year, and they talked about the amount of hydrogen projects that are going on in the world. And so it is evident that there is a significant uptick in major hydrogen projects around the world. So you can see how much of that's going on in Europe. And then also in Asia. So there's quite a cluster of activities in Europe and Asia, and then some others around the world. We'll get into that. But the investment is now on the books for these projects is at 500 billion. of which they're saying 150 billion is relatively mature projects. Next slide, please. And then they talk a little bit about in that report the mix between low carbon versus renewable, and renewable would be electrolyzers or something bio-based, and the low carbon would be either the CCS type application, steam methane reforming of natural gas with carbon capture and storage, or other related technologies. So it seems to be about 2/3 on the renewables and only 1/3 on the hydrocarbon side for those projects at this point in time. Next slide, please. I wanted to have a quick look at China because, again, this is from the McKinsey report of July this year, because it is a potential market for exporting hydrogen from Canada if we get there. And so what's going on over there is also a pretty significant number of investments, over 50 large-scale hydrogen projects announced and $180 billion value. And being driven very largely by their net zero by 2060 commitment and peak carbon emissions in key sectors before 2030. Next slide, please. This slide talks a little bit about the applications, and Hayden referred to where we might use hydrogen cost effectively. And this is a Bloomberg, slide, which talks about the cost effectiveness of using hydrogen as a carbon abatement tool. And so on the left, it's showing cars, buses, trucks. So transportation is actually the lowest cost. It's a little bit surprising because there's a fair of cost to transport hydrogen. So I'm not sure what assumptions they're making there, but we know if the hydrogen isn't close to where it's needed, it can be a significant cost to get it, transport and move it around. But I think this would be assuming you're manufacturing carbon close to where it's needed to have that kind of level of low cost. And that, of course, in refining, we're using hydrogen for hydro treating. This means you're basically removing sulfur from your fuel products, whether it's diesel or gasoline, and you use hydrogen to do that. And then the next one is steel. So they're saying, hey, well, we could use hydrogen in the steel industry, and that's for their high thermal heat loads that they need in the manufacturing process. And then you so on and so forth up the food chain in terms of getting your bang for your buck using hydrogen. And it's interesting that shipping is so far out there. I would have thought it might be way back with the cars, buses, trucks, because it's a transportation mode. So I'm not sure what that's all about. I need to dig into that one a little bit more. It looks a little bit odd to me that it's way out there on the right. Next slide, please. This was from the Zen report, which probably was an input, Hayden, to your strategy in BC. And again, it just shows how you manufacture hydrogen. So on the very, very top, some industrial processes have hydrogen as an off gas. So ethylene crackers and some of these petrochemical processes have hydrogen as a byproduct. And so if you could capture that hydrogen and do something with it. We did that actually at Scotford when I was working there on an oil sands project. We needed hydrogen for hydro cracking, and we used their off gas instead of manufacturing it. So, and then you see through the middle, the wind and hydropowered. So these are renewable types of electricity and producing electrolysis of water to produce what they call green hydrogen. So that is, I think that's kind of the main alley right now that people are looking at in terms of how we're going to manufacture renewable hydrogen or green. And it's like, let's do it by electrolysis because we have all this renewable energy in BC. So I think that's kind of a very big theme. And then as we go further down, you'll see that we can use biomass, but that's a tricky business because if you're using biomass, you got to collect it, you got to transport it, but you could make hydrogen through gasification of biomass. And I don't know how that would look in terms of remote communities. It is fairly sophisticated technology, so it's not like you just have a regular furnace there. You need a gas of a high pressure temperature type of unit to make hydrogen from biomass, to gasify it, and to clean it up. And then down on the bottom is the natural gas. We can use natural gas, which of course is very abundant in BC, and to make hydrogen, but there's a couple different ways. The first one is reforming with steam, basically, and that's the most common way of making hydrogen in the world today, is basically using natural gas, reforming it with steam, producing hydrogen, but there is a but here. The byproduct of that is CO2, and CO2 in a gaseous form, which is often just vented. And so that's where we would need carbon capture and storage to go with that one, to make it low carbon hydrogen. That's what we did at Scotford. When I worked there, we built a project called Quest, and it captured all the CO2 from our hydrogen, from our steam methane reformers that were making hydrogen for our refinery and our oil sands upgrader. And then we captured the CO2 and we put it deep into the geological formation in the region, which was sandstone rock 2 kilometers deep. That's the CCS component. And then the last two are the emerging technologies, thermal and plasma, and often called thermal plasma pyrolysis. So combining those two terms to make hydrogen. And in that case, you end up with a solid carbon waste. So you don't end up with CO2 going in the atmosphere. You end up with this pile of black soot on the ground that you have to figure out what to do with. You could bury it and just sequester it that way, or you could use it for other products. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think this is an exciting area, these last two, and I want to talk a little bit more about them, thermal plasma pyrolysis, because it does allow us to unlock the natural gas that we have in BC. And it is very cost effective. We'll see that in the next few slides. Next slide, please, Shanda. So here's sort of the cost breakdown to manufacture hydrogen. This is from the Zen report. And you'll see on the left, you could make, if you could just get it from somebody else as a byproduct, that's the cheapest way. An ethylene cracker is often a common source of hydrogen. Steam, the next bar, SMR, is steam methane reforming, but that assumes you're making hydrogen from natural gas and venting the CO2, which of course we don't want to do. And then the blue bar on the fourth one is the steam methane reforming with the carbon capture storage, which is what we did in Edmonton for the Quest project. The turquoise bar in between with the circle is the cost of thermal plasma pyrolysis, according to the Zen report. But we're also seeing from some of the leading suppliers of this technology, and we're going to see that in later slides, a group called Monolith, that this is cheaper than SMR, or steam methane reforming plus CCS, and that they can produce a low carbon hydrogen cheaper than the blue bar can. And then as we go up further along here, you'll see electrolysis. The green bar is where the most of the focus is today for producing hydrogen renewably. It's fairly expensive at this chart showing at $5 per kilogram. Now we do know that cost is coming down, and it is very much dependent on the cost of the electricity and on the cost of the electrolyzer technology. And I think the electrolyzer technology costs are coming down. They expect by 2030 it would be down by 1/3, which is great. And then also, if you had a renewable energy, shall we say, let's say we had a wind farm hooked up and dedicated for electrolysis, I'm sure you could be producing that power if it was simply intermittent at significantly less than $60 a megawatt hour. So If you had a dedicated wind farm for electrolyzing water to hydrogen, maybe you're at half the cost of that, at $30. Anyway, so there's ways to get that green bar down as well. And that's well, that's kind of what the gray bar is here, off grid. I honestly believe it would be lower. They're showing it higher, but I think it would be lower. Anyways, next slide, please. All that to say, electrolysis is still your high cost way to make hydrogen, but there's promise in terms of getting those costs down. This is the carbon intensity. So steam methane reforming on the left, that's having with no CCS. If you add CCS, it's the blue bar, and the pyrolysis is what we call the turquoise bar. You can see that the carbon content is almost zero there. And electrolysis, of course, from using renewable energy, it's zero. The pyrolysis would assume also renewable electricity. So to get to that little turquoise bar. And then the Monolith guys are talking about possibly going negative on the production of their hydrogen by mixing renewable electricity and also some biomass in the process. So yeah, instead of simply natural gas, they would have a mix of say 80% natural gas and 20% biomass gas, and you could get pyrolysis with a negative carbon footprint. Okay, next slide, please. Energy needed to manufacture hydrogen. This is an important factor, but it does play out in the costs. And one of the reasons the electrolysis is one of the higher costs is you'll see that middle bar, option 1, water electrolysis. You see the orange bar on the right. That's because it takes significantly more energy to make that hydrogen. And so even though the energy you're inputting is carbon free or renewable, you're using a lot of it. And so that's why it costs so much to do it that way. And whereas if you look at steam methane reforming, the top bar, or methane pyrolysis, the bottom bar, the amount of energy needed is significantly less than the electrolysis. Now, I feel this is a little bit overstated, but I feel that maybe the pyrolysis is about 1/3 of the electrolysis. This one shows a little bit less. So I can't remember where this came from. Anyways, next slide, please. And then this technology has been emerging, shall I say, an R&D kind of focus for about 10 years. And it is making hydrogen from using natural gas as a source, plus renewable energy, which so you're putting in the plasma or thermal heat is coming through electrical source. And so in this case, we would use BC grid, for example, and to produce the hydrogen and with a solid carbon waste. And so this group called Monolith, I think, is leading the charge now. They are the most advanced in their technology, having built their first commercial scale plant in Nebraska, and now looking at building, well, I think the commercial scale plant is, I can't remember how many tons per day of hydrogen. It's only about 5 tons per day, whatever that is in per year. It's 1,500, whatever, a little more. And so it's commercial scale. So now they're looking at building 12 more of these things. Next slide, please. There's a picture of their plant in Olive Creek, Nebraska. And so that's the first commercial scale hydrogen pyrolysis plant. It was completed last year in June. Next slide, please. And they're looking at building 12 more of these things on site. They just take them like cookie cutters, and they're permitting it, I guess, right now. Next slide, please. It's worth noting this is probably the next front runner on the pyrolysis technology is Basf, a very large firm with in chemicals and chemical processing. And so they are also getting ready to build their first commercial project. So all of this to say, this pyrolysis, production of hydrogen by pyrolysis is emerging, and is it a game changer? It does have lower cost, it has lower energy needs, and it is zero carbon, provided you either just bury the carbon or use the carbon for other byproducts. I think the Monolith guys talk about using the carbon for rubber products, and other carbon fibers, anodes for electrolysis, those kinds of things. So there's quite a market for what we call carbon black, which is a sophisticated market for carbon dust, shall we say. Yeah, so it's there it is. It does have, it's looking very interesting, pyrolysis versus the steam methane reforming or the electrolysis. Next slide, please. So this sort of pivots our discussion now a little bit to how do we ship hydrogen overseas? We talk about hydrogen export opportunities. And so let's shift from thinking domestically now, how do we produce hydrogen? And I think you would produce hydrogen in a number of different ways domestically in your strategy. If you had a CCS hub, you might use steam methane reforming. If you didn't, and you were remote, well, you might use electrolysis. Or if you did have access to the pyrolysis technology and it's remote, you might use that. So I think you would use the different technologies in the strategy depending on the circumstance. But when it comes to export, we need to think a little differently. We need to think about energy density and how to get this stuff from the BC coast all the way to Asia most cost effectively. And this chart shows on the left that compressed hydrogen gas has a very low energy content per U volume. That's the bottom axis, going from 0 all the way over to 1.25. You'll see that compressed hydrogen gas has a very low energy content per unit volume. If you liquefy it, it gets significantly better at 0.25, but still, if you produced hydrogen and converted it to methanol, and shipped methanol, you'd be up at 0.5. And then, of course, liquefied natural gas has hydrogen molecules in it, and because it's just methane, and it's got 3 times the energy content per unit volume that liquid hydrogen does. So I guess the question in my mind is, would you really ship liquid nitrogen across the Pacific Ocean? Or would you just ship liquefied natural gas? Because we've already done that. We've already built all the infrastructure. We put it on our ships, we get it to Asia, and then we let them convert the gas to hydrogen, either using pyrolysis or steam methane reforming with CCS. So I think that's, and I think the answer to that will be, well, it depends on what kind of technologies they have in these countries that are receiving the product. But I think this is just to jog people's minds that, I think shipping hydrogen in a form of hydrogen is probably not that economic, and that people are looking very much at how do we ship it more economically? Do we convert it to methanol first, or do we convert it to ammonia? There's a pretty big push to produce ammonia and ship it as ammonia and then get it over there to another country, and then you can get the hydrogen out of the ammonia. So ammonia actually falls a little bit just near methanol, a little bit between methanol and ethanol in its energy density. So, but I guess my argument would be, well, hey, we're making liquefied natural gas. Let's just send that over there. They can convert it to hydrogen over there. Next slide, please. And that's what this slide talks about, that LNG is 3 times the greater energy density than hydrogen. That's liquid hydrogen. And moving the molecules as LNG might make the most sense. And then at the point of delivery, they could convert it using hydrogen by pyrolysis or steam methane reforming. with CCS. Next slide, please. Yeah, I guess maybe just go back one. I think my point here is also that if you can deliver LNG as a feedstock for hydrogen production in other countries, that probably might be the most cost-effective way to deliver the molecules. And it means that the infrastructure, the LNG infrastructure we're building today, does not need to be repurposed. It's still the primary way of moving those molecules in an export scenario. Yeah, next slide, please. And then the last slides, I've shown these before, but it was just sort of my vision of what the potential 2050 scenario for BC could be, that we're not only the so I talk about the global energy demand, and that Asia and China is very much leading the energy demand charge, and that we're exporting our LNG there as well as other natural resources to help them on their path to net zero. And then my view is by 2050 that we've achieved our net zero. We've got a carbon neutral grid. We have hydrogen contributing its part to particularly the heavy industry and maybe the heavy transport sectors to decarbonize them. And we have a mix of the green and blue, and I might argue the turquoise, which is the pyrolysis one. We'll call that turquoise hydrogen. And that local hubs, hydrogen hubs, are important, and they might need hydrogen specific pipelines, and that long range hydrogen transport might still best be done as natural gas. And so we don't repurpose the pipelines if they're long range transport. We keep it as gas, and then we convert the gas to hydrogen at the other end. Call it pyrolysis or steam methane reforming. And yeah, and BC continues to be a global leader in the export of low CO2 natural resources. Next slide, please. And then we start to think about our own domestic scenario. Well, our ports, that we have Kitimat, Prince Rupert ports, that the ports are equipped with hydrogen manufacturing. I know whether we're using the hydrogen as fuel itself, or whether we're using the hydrogen to manufacture low carbon fuels like methanol or something else for ships and rail and heavy transport. And then BC Transport, again, they could be using the hydrogen just for fuel cell drives, whether it's rail, trucking, busing, mining equipment. And BC Industry, again, I think that's about having hydrogen hubs around the industrial hubs would be an important piece. And we do need a CCS hub in BC. That's Hayden, we can talk about that one offline. That one can also be an enabler for hydrogen. And BC buildings, well, that's a question mark, but if you did have fuel cell electric capacity, but again, we have such a low carbon grid, it's hard to know that that hydrogen would have a role in buildings, but it could have, particularly around fuel cell electrics. Small scale pyrolysis was another concept I had, where you could put a small scale pyrolysis unit right at a major building hub, university or something like that. Anyways, that's my presentation, and thanks for your time.